Welcome to the Tech Ed Podcast, where we visit with leaders who are shaping, innovating, and disrupting technical education. People who are not afraid to think differently, not afraid to try something new, all with the goal of securing the American dream for the next generation of STEM and workforce talent. Well, welcome back to the Tech Ed Podcast. As our listeners know, we are now streaming in 106 countries around the globe on over 45 podcast platforms. So there are a lot of folks that get the opportunity every single week to tune in to the Tech Ed Podcast. Well, today's guest was in my hometown of Milwaukee not too long ago, speaking to a huge group of business people. And I had actually two people separately who were both in the audience for that presentation say, you got to have this gentleman on your podcast. So that is why we are here today with an individual who is the Senior Vice President of the United States Chamber of Commerce Global Energy Institute. His name is Christopher Guith. And Christopher, thank you so much for being on with us.
Well, thanks for such a warm welcome, Matt. I'm very happy to be here and chat.
I would love to hear you share with our audience, what is the U.S. Chamber's Global Energy Institute?
Sure. So the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is, very similar to probably the chambers of commerce that most of your listeners are familiar with. They're all separate and individual, but we exist to represent our members, corporations, businesses in policy discussions at the federal level, much like the Wisconsin Chamber does it at the state level in Madison. And we have thousands of members. The vast majority of them are small businesses or even solo practitioners. Within the chamber, we represent, or we have to be able to speak to every single issue a business could care about. And I work in the part of the U.S. Chamber that handles energy, environment, climate, sustainability. So my colleagues and I handle every possible issue that any business could care about within those policy areas.
That's crazy. So literally like any small business, any mid-sized business, any large business, these are your members. And you think about just the wide variety of different enterprises all over the United States and having to find a way to represent them at the federal level on this whole wide variety of issues. It's got to be almost an insurmountable task. And you think about, global energy just on its own has to be almost insurmountable. Obviously, you've created quite a tremendous amount of knowledge around the topics affecting, global energy policy, geopolitical effects on energy policy. Looking forward to getting into that. But one of the things we love asking our guests, Christopher, when they join us on the Tech Ed Podcast, it's just a personal fascination of mine, is how do you find your way into a career like this? Tell us how you got here.
I went to law school, and to make a really long story short, my goal was to be a Marine Corps JAG lawyer. And I got medically disqualified twice. And I had to fall back on plan B. And I had always been involved in electoral politics going back to high school and college. So I came to DC and I practiced law for a couple of years. And then I went to Capitol Hill. And it was in 2001 that some of your viewers, probably not all of them, might remember the Enron debacle that ultimately resulted in a summer of rolling blackouts throughout California. As a Californian, I took great interest in this. I was working on Capitol Hill for a member of Congress from Georgia, but it sort of dawned on me young in my career that, hey, this energy thing is kind of big. I mean, it affects every single American. It affects every single business. And so I really decided then and there that I wanted to spend a lot more time on that. And at that point, I sought out subsequent jobs that were focused exclusively within that space. And I've worked for two members of Congress. I was an appointee in the Bush administration at the Department of Energy. And I've been privileged to work at the U.S. Chamber twice now for about 16 years. And, just having such a diverse membership, it forces one to kind of get smart on everything over obviously a long period of time. But there's probably not many issues that I haven't encountered or my members haven't encountered and brought to me.
I can imagine. It's interesting, first of all, that as you reminisce on that 2001 timeframe, it's hard to believe that it's been 20 plus years since the Enron debacle, but I am certainly old enough to to remember that, to remember what happened to the likes of Anderson Consulting and Arthur Anderson through that process. Names like Dennis Kozlowski jumping out at me, and all those crazy memories of the summer of 2001. In some ways, the world has changed a lot, and in other ways, maybe it hasn't changed so much. But as we look at changes, the area of energy is really evolving as well, and I want to get into that. I took some time to study your mission at the Global Energy Institute, which is to unify policymakers, regulators, business leaders, and the American public behind a common sense energy strategy to help keep America secure, prosperous, and clean. Regular members and listeners, rather, to the Tech Ed podcast will certainly recognize that we like that term, common sense. We take all comers. We're apolitical, and in fact, we say quite often, if you share our mission of securing the American dream for the next generation of STEM and workforce talent, we don't really care who you voted for last time. We don't care about who you're going to vote for next time. Let's work on this together. But that term common sense, like I said, we like it. What is it about energy policy, particularly, though, that becomes such a lightning rod for so many Americans?
It's just one of those issues that the political folks in DC and around the country have really used it to be a wedge issue. You talk about something like the Keystone Pipeline. Very few people really ever heard of it until one day, thousands of activists surrounded the White House in, I think it was 2014, 2015, and all of a sudden it was on the front page of every paper. And it became a litmus test. If either you're a climate hawk and you should stop the pipeline, or you're focused on energy security and it should be built tomorrow. And I mean, there's many different examples like that. But I think part of it is as Americans become kind of more versed in what climate change is and what it's not, there's this sort of aspiration to change everything overnight. And the energy economy doesn't run on aspirations. It runs on electrons and it runs on molecules. And until you have a path to move from point A to point B, you can't do that. And when you put policies in place that assume that you're already at point B, bad things happen. I mean, it wasn't necessarily climate focused, but that 2001 episode in California, it's bad policy. And you see sort of what has happened in Europe over the last year and a half, even before Russia invaded Ukraine. It was basing its policies off of aspirations. It wanted to transition away from traditional forms of energy, which in this case, we're talking about coal, oil, natural gas, but also nuclear, before they had the technologies to replace it. And then when they lost all of this imported energy from Russia, it really put energy reliability in question. And we saw prices skyrocket last summer, and it's really made the European economy in general start to deindustrialize. You cannot run a manufacturing facility that consumes massive amounts of energy when the price of energy is 10 times what it was a year before that. And there's going to be ramifications for years and years to come. And obviously we realized some of that this summer too. We saw gasoline prices across the country get above $5 a gallon for the first time. And while we are relatively energy secure because we're the largest oil and natural gas producer in the world, it's a fungible global commodity. And so when prices go up in Europe, it starts to suck some of those supplies into Europe, and it makes the prices go up here. So it reminds all of us that energy security is still paramount. And within the business community, it's important for me to emphasize, it's not the energy transition over energy security or energy security over the energy transition. It has to be both. But you have to be realistic, and to go back to that term, use common sense when it comes to how you plan that transition.
There's an example that's kind of coming to the top of my mind that I think is going to resonate with you, Christopher. And this goes back again to the early first part of the century, 2001-ish. And I was running a fairly large manufacturing operation. It was the largest contract metal finishing facility in North America. And right about that time, natural gas, I think it was about the middle of that year, spiked from, it was like $2.50 a decatherm, give or take, and spiked up to over 12. And it was a huge part of our cost structure because, without going into too much detail, all of the process heating that we needed to do was done using natural gas, either directly or indirectly. And so because of that, think about this huge part of our cost structure that all of a sudden increases in cost by almost an order of magnitude. And just trying to manage a business through something like that was, it's one of the most harrowing experiences of my of my career. And that was just, one small company here in the, the greater scope of the United States. It really speaks to a lot of things, in part having a diverse energy portfolio. You mentioned coal, you mentioned natural gas, certainly oil, nuclear. Why is it so important for us to have a diversified portfolio of energy sources here in the United States?
Well, there's two basic reasons. We all learned as a child that you don't put all of your eggs in one basket. So, having redundancy is important. I mean, we live in a country where energy reliability is sacrosanct. We can't afford to have doubts when we flip the switch that the lights are going to go on. And anytime you're dealing with physics and mechanical operations, sometimes there's going to be problems. Sometimes there's going to be shortages of fuel. There'll be shortages of sunlight and wind. So having multiple sources that you can fall back on ensures that we keep the lights on. And secondly, it causes competition. And competition is good for the consumer because it drives prices down. In most of the country, we're paying less for electricity right now than we did even 10 years ago. And part of that is because, one of the probably the biggest transformational change in the last 10 or 20 years has been the advent of fracking and turning the United States from very insecure and having energy scarce. Like you said, natural gas was trading around $12 or $13 a million BTU in 2005, and today it's $2. And it's because we were able to bring massive amounts of new supply online. And when you have more supply and demand stays the same, prices go down. And that's been the case for natural gas and oil to a lesser extent. So it's transformational, to say the least.
The law of supply and demand, and Adam Smith, alive and well in the world of energy policy and energy pricing, and both they go hand in hand, right? Reliability and price, and the more reliable we have in terms of energy sources, the less we're going to spend on energy. So obviously really, really important to any of us that are doing business, any of our educators that are running school districts, universities, community colleges, and certainly Americans in general as they think about how energy policy affects the cost of heating their homes and so on. So really a diverse set of sources of energy, really important. And then you think about the environmental implications and the efficiency environmentally of doing things like burning wood, which a huge part of the earth still creates, cooks their food and heats their homes using wood. And then you think about oil, and then you think about natural gas, and kind of progressively cleaner. In terms of greenhouse gases, the cleanest forms of creating or methods of creating energy is nuclear energy. But yet so many are afraid of nuclear. And so my question is, first of all, why is that? Why do we have this fear of nuclear energy? Should we be afraid of it? And are we ever going to get to a point where we can build a new nuclear reactor here in the United States?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've worked in and around nuclear policy for a couple decades, and I think the short answer is in the early 60s, when the environmental movement, really started hitting its stride. There was I don't know if it was intentional or not, but there was a conflation of civilian nuclear power and nuclear weapons. And somehow they were related. Obviously, they used the same technology, but for very different purposes and very different applications. And so it became, Jane Fonda and the China syndrome. This, even if you're not going to use it to create a weapon, it itself is a weapon. And who knows, maybe there could be a meltdown and it'll, propel through the Earth's core all the way to China. No basis in reality or physics whatsoever. But I think the important thing is that as policymakers, especially on the left, who have become, more and more concerned about climate change, it's forced them to relook at some of these ancient tropes that they've had that have been, kind of standard policy positions for decades. And nuclear is one of those issues where you see significant bipartisanship now. If you would have told me in 2019 that the Democratic nominee for president was going to run on a platform that supported nuclear and also carbon capture, I wouldn't have believed it. But candidate Joe Biden did, and to his credit, his Department of Energy has been very supportive of moving those technologies, the advanced form of nuclear. So to your question about building, coincidentally, a utility in Georgia just finished construction of two brand new reactors. They're the very large ones like we have scattered throughout the country. I think we're down to about 94 of them now. And it it just went critical, meaning that they just started the chain reaction of nuclear fission, and it'll start producing power for the South, in a matter of weeks. And then the second one is going to come online later on this year. But those are probably one-offs. No one else is even looking at building a full-size reactor like that. Both utilities and their consumers, as well as policymakers, have really started to move towards an advanced form of nuclear reactor that is much smaller. They call them small modular reactors. They're a fraction of the size of the existing reactors, and they're modular, so they can be manufactured instead of like built from the ground up, which takes forever and always costs more than anticipated. And there's a big question, when is the first one actually going to get built? I mean, technically, we have a bunch of small reactors in our nuclear submarines and our nuclear aircraft carriers, but we haven't built one for commercial purposes. But there has been very significant bipartisan support to create policies to really move that ball forward. And I'm relatively confident in saying the first commercial small modular reactor in the world will be built in the United States in the next 10 years.
I was actually kind of thinking this morning about how, the whole idea that and I don't know, maybe you saw the article in the Wall Street Journal about how kind of American norms and perceptions are changing. They did a fascinating survey of just kind of what people feel is important and what they don't feel is important. And we've lived in this arena in some ways for the last 20 years, really probably even more than that, 30 years, where the U.S. is the lone global superpower and really not, from a geopolitical and standpoint, not tons, always something to worry about, but not tons and tons of stuff to worry about, relatively speaking, that we've maybe gotten a little bit complacent in our thinking and maybe don't value some of the things that were used to be important. But to me, one of those is how we figure out how do we be less vitriolic and less combative with each other and put our heads together and figure out how we make things work. The world in the future isn't going to get any easier. You mentioned the war between Russia and Ukraine, and now how some of the, NATO on one side, and now, China and the leaders of China and Russia getting together over this last week and talking about their partnership. But, it is a little bit scary when we think about the future. How does national energy policy kind of align with national security, and how do you see one impacting the other?
In some ways, they're kind of inseparable and intertwined. Having the largest military in the world, it requires a lot of resources. I mean, it requires fuel to move it around in massive amounts of it. The U.S. military is the largest energy consumer in the world. It needs natural resources to build the munitions and the platforms that our military relies on, and we rely on them for. And one great sort of anecdote of where this all comes to a head, and it involves China, because China is far and away our largest adversary right now and doesn't look to be wanting to play nice anymore. But if you look at the commodity critical minerals, there's roughly, I think, 45 of them. These are things like lithium and cobalt. There's a massive supply around the world, but there really hadn't been a significant demand until relatively recently. And you look at the things that we rely on every day, things like, our cell phones, they have a lot of lithium. But then you look at kind of the technologies of tomorrow, things like electric vehicles. They have massive amounts of lithium and cobalt in them. And we don't produce any of this at home. We have significant amounts of it, but we are forced to import it. And the Chinese have been very strategically diabolical over the last 20 years. They have cornered the market on critical minerals. They have gone around the world and either bought mines or made agreements with other governments to own the mines and then be able to take what's mined out of them back to China and then process them. So it's not even just the minerals themselves, but it's also having that processing capability to turn those minerals into the widgets that go into, a navigation system in an advanced fighter, or, like I said, an electric vehicle. And at this point, China controls roughly 90% of all the minerals and 90% of the processing. And we, the United States, and this is true for almost every country in the West, we haven't gotten our climate aspirations and our aversion to mining in lockstep yet. There's an acknowledgement that if there's going to be an energy transition and an effort to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, which is what the Paris Agreement stated, then you're talking about a transformation that likes the world has never seen, and you're going to need just massive, exponentially larger amounts of these minerals. So where are we going to get them from? The Department of Defense is scared to death that we're so reliant upon China. One, because obviously there can be supply chain issues anytime China wants, whether there's a conflict or not. I mean, we saw the Chinese cut off the Japanese for these minerals a couple years ago over arguments, regional arguments in the South China Sea. So there's the supply chain issue, but then there's also the question of, do we know what the full ramifications are of having these Chinese manufactured, again, I'll call them widgets because it's a bunch of different things, in U.S. military applications? Are there vulnerabilities there that we don't know about? And so there's a need to look at home and start producing domestically. And it's going slowly, but a lot of times when you talk to Democrats on Capitol Hill and in the administration, when you talk about mining, they, visions of mountaintop exploding in Appalachia come to mind. And that's not what we're talking about. If you look at how we mine in this country, it's almost exclusively in the Intermountain West in Alaska, and they're the most sustainable mines in the world. I mean, they leave the earth literally better than it was when they started. But we're going to have to solve that because energy security is paramount and national security are paramount, and the two in this case and many other cases linked hand in hand.
I can't help but see parallels between, what we're seeing on the microprocessor side of things. And of course, they're related. But, that over the course of the last couple of years is something that almost every American felt in one way or another, whether they were trying to get a new vehicle, trying to get a phone, trying to get a new microwave, I mean, whatever it is, if it had a microprocessor or a chip in it, it was a challenge to get our hands on those types of things. And it sounds like the same kind of situation is kind of resting under the surface, pardon the pun, with regard to some of these minerals like lithium that are so very important, not just for the batteries in our mobile phones, as you mentioned, but huge implications in electric vehicles. And we know that technology is going to transform as well. So in as much as we felt the huge impact of not being able to get microprocessors, and now we've had the Chips and Science Act and significant focus on that, almost seems like we have to have the same national freakout on this whole idea of minerals. I was with actually a former guest on the Tech Ed podcast, ran an $8 billion plus business in the mining industry for years. And we had a similar conversation last summer where he said, look, we have all these minerals that we could ever want right under the ground here in the United States. It's a question of having logical policy and educating people around, what's a risk and what isn't. And it's not an either or, right? I mean, if we don't mine these minerals here, we are going to be at the mercy of the Chinese and others in terms of the very future of our national security to that point in our very way of life. So really, really important. As we think about how we balance both of those, speaking of balance, we've got this whole balance between clean energy and affordable energy. And to your point, when we have tried to go a little bit, get too far over our skis with some of the alternatives to traditional sources of energy, we can get ourselves into trouble. Are those concepts, though, clean energy and affordable energy, Christopher, are those mutually exclusive, or can we do both? And if so, how?
Well, I hope not. I mean, we have to do both. I mean, if listeners don't remember anything else I say, I mean, there's a couple of very important statistics. One, the International Energy Agency, which is made up of developed country governments. The United States is one, but most of them are in Europe. So it's not exactly Fox News. They've estimated that roughly 50% of the technologies that the global economy would need to decarbonize by 2050 don't exist yet commercially. So that doesn't mean you don't exploit the 50% that do, but there are infirmities there. I mean, wind and solar is great, and we've seen the amount of electricity generated from those sources increase exponentially over the last 20 years. But everyone knows they're intermittent. The wind can only produce power when it's blowing, and solar can only produce power when the sun's out. So what do you do in those other times when we still demand that we have electricity? You need natural gas. Natural gas can come on in a split second and make up for a shortfall in those technologies. But if you look, going back again to the 50% of the technologies don't exist, I think we all learn, much like don't put your eggs in one basket, we learn an important lesson about gravity in elementary school playing on the playground. When you're swinging on the monkey bars, you can't let go of the rung you're hanging on until you can fully grab the one that you're reaching for. We're pretty close, but we're 50% not close. And so if you put policies in place that assume that you've already reached that rung, you're going to fall. And we sort of have a saying that you cannot move the energy transition any faster than the pace of innovation. We need that other 50% in order to get to that rung. And we're just not really there yet. But because of the competition we talked about as far as diversification, we've seen prices stay significantly lower than anyone anticipated, partially because of subsidies and partially because of scaling. We've seen the cost of wind power essentially get cheaper than almost every other form of power in many parts of the country. Now, like I said, it's not always available, so you need to have other sources. But the two absolutely aren't mutually exclusive, and we've seen a lot of bipartisan support. Again, I mean, Congress rightfully has a reputation for being extremely partisan. The country is extremely partisan, but that doesn't mean that there's not mutuality and agreement. And we've seen that recently in support for developing these technologies we know we're going to need but don't have yet. Things like advanced nuclear, things like storage, so that you can essentially make wind and solar that are intermittent, make them available 24/7. If you can produce the electrons when people aren't using them and save them, and then later on when the sun goes down, you can dispatch them. Okay, now we're in business. And hydrogen also, there's significant bipartisan support around all of these. And transformational policies have been put in place over the last 2, 3, 4 years in order to continue to develop the technologies that we know we need but don't have yet.
But to your point, none of that happens without innovation. I can't help but note that we're having this conversation on the heels of the world losing Gordon Moore, who in some ways was one of my heroes, the CEO, former CEO of Intel, founder of Intel. Shockley Semiconductor before that. Just a fascinating background. Came up with the idea of Moore's Law that we talk about quite a bit on the Tech Ed podcast. And originally, the idea that the speed at which we can process information digitally doubles initially every year, then every 2 years, but roughly every 12 to 18 months. Same thing happening in so many sectors of the economy where products are doubling in price performance every 12 to 18 months. You mentioned the exponential decrease in the cost of electricity generated from wind power as just one example. So that whole idea of the exponential economy, so many times innovation moves faster than we expect it to. And sometimes we take today's paradigm and assume that's going to continue forever and use that projected into the future. There's so many examples of how that can lead us to some erroneous solutions or conclusions. But I've seen this technology and this concept of Moore's Law and the exponential economy, as we call it, quite a bit in manufacturing, as we use manufacturing technology that's advancing at warp speed. What's kind of the prediction for the next several years in terms of energy technology? Are we moving into an era where we are going to see exponential decreases in the cost of producing electricity using solar and using wind and hydrogen and some of these other sources that maybe are cleaner over the course of time, but we're not quite there yet? What does the future hold for that innovation?
Well, I mean, from a pure, physics standpoint, we're essentially in the age of enlightenment. We're seeing innovations and advents, rolling out of the labs and in the field every single day. That doesn't always translate into cheaper costs, at least at upfront. You need scaling. You need to get past sort of the first of a kind engineering, and that's it's worth noting that one of those pieces of bipartisan legislation that I was referencing, it made a very significant commitment to developing these new technologies. And one of the biggest barriers is that, Acme, the average company, is very risk averse when it comes to investing in first of a kind technologies. You don't know what you don't know. And first of a kind almost always takes longer than you anticipate and costs more than it anticipates. So what Congress did was gave a significant sum of money to the Department of Energy, depending upon how you measure it, something approaching $30 billion. But beyond the money, they gave the Department of Energy the authority to go out and build pilot projects. So a lot of people are very interested in, having one of those small modular reactors or, a hydrogen fueled facility, or, having a carbon capture attached to their petrochemical facility, but they don't really want to be the first one to do it. Let somebody else do that, and then they absorb all the risk, and then I can invest in it. So what Congress did was told the Department of Energy to go out and build them, build a couple of these small reactors, build a couple of carbon capture projects, build hydrogen hubs throughout the country so we can really study the engineering and the physics of what it would mean to transition into a hydrogen economy. And that way, the government essentially absorbs the risk on behalf of all taxpayers and can work the kinks out. And then the private sector can come in and take that intellectual property and scale it and commercialize it. I'm very hopeful and optimistic that model, that approach is going to make those cleaner, in some cases, more reliable technologies available at competitive prices, and ultimately not force ratepayers like us to incur those additional costs.
It's interesting. When you think about, the things that government should be doing, at least in my view, are things that we can't do on our own, right? A national military, no private company is going to, privatize national security. And education might be another example. And in this case, you're saying in some cases, the innovation around energy is the same way that some of these risks might be too great for an individual company to take on, or an individual venture capitalist or speculative investor to want to put their money into something that may or may not turn into ubiquitous technology, for lack of a better term. And it sounds like you're supportive of the of the federal government and the Department of Energy making these investments. What's the criteria when you look at something like that for when you support a large subsidy like that and when you don't?
We're a trade association, so we listen to our members. The tail cannot wag the dog. And I think I know there's been a sea change within the business community as far as the role of the federal government in developing these technologies. You see energy companies of all stripes under significant pressure from their investors, from their customers, from their employees to move into lower emitting technologies faster. Well, they also have a obligation to their shareholders to maximize the return on the capital those shareholders invested. So they're kind of between a rock and a hard place. Enter the federal government. Okay, we can't do this on our own. We want to move in this direction. We're prepared to invest significant sums of capital in this direction, but we need you to catalyze the development of those technologies. And conversely, we've seen pretty significant shift within the rank and file Republican member of Congress too. Even 5 or 10 years ago, that's the role of the private sector. We don't need to be subsidizing it. But much like I referenced earlier, that we've seen evolution from elected Democrats on certain things like carbon capture and nuclear. We've seen the Republican caucus as a whole, start to move towards, okay, this is tremendously important from an energy security and national security standpoint. Especially as we, every day the world gets riskier and riskier. Okay, let's figure out how to do this. Let's make this part of the federal government's role. And I'm not going to say it's unanimous by any stretch of the imagination, but there's significant, noteworthy bipartisan consensus that ultimately you need to pass this type of legislation, and ultimately led to passage of that type of legislation.
Actually, it gives you a little reason for optimism that maybe we can get things done in Washington, D.C. when people think about them logically and really think about the implications of some of the skirmishes that we get ourselves into, rightly or wrongly sometimes. So his fingers crossed, to your point, that we can continue in that direction. And when there are policies and when there are issues that we can all agree on, or at least agree substantially on, let's not let the politics or interpersonal issues get in the way of that. Because we do need incredible innovation in every sector of our economy, and the energy sector is certainly no exception to that. One of the things that we see, and we bring on a lot of guests from a lot of different market sectors, a lot of different spaces within the economy. Just about every one of them is giving us examples about how smart technology, smart sensors, smart devices, and by that we mean these, edge devices that can communicate with each other, have embedded intelligence, can make their own decisions, really transforming a lot of different areas of our economy. Is that happening in the energy sector as well, Christopher?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would argue that over the last 20 years, the energy sector has been the leader in innovation out of any sector. I mean, if you look, we referenced it a couple of times where we were in the early 2000s, prices were high. We were increasingly dependent upon imports of everything. And, we sort of hit the bottom in 2005 as far as the amount of oil and natural gas we were producing. And then self-described crazy engineer named George Mitchell in Texas kind of hit the mother lode figuratively and then literally, which is pairing directional drilling and hydraulic fracturing to get at large sources of oil and natural gas that we knew existed, but did not have an efficient or economic way to produce them. And so in the early 2000s, in the industry that you came from, we were shedding tens of thousands of jobs overseas because the price of natural gas, which is a tremendous feedstock for the petrochemical industry, was significantly cheaper everywhere else. We were building import terminals around the country because we were running out of gas. Then all of a sudden, almost overnight, this magical key opened the door to seemingly unlimited amounts of natural gas. And within a short period of time, we became the largest natural gas producer in the world. The price plummeted, and all of a sudden, hundreds of billions of dollars were being invested in this country to take advantage of that largesse. Soon, that technology was transferred to liquids and producing oil, and then we became the largest oil producer in the world. So it's great for our economy. That money's being invested here in places like North Dakota and New Mexico, and not in places like Venezuela or Saudi Arabia. But it also means that we don't have to be reliant upon other countries for our energy security. And then if you look at, to your question, getting into how things like AI and supercomputing have affected it, I mean, there's two, I think, good examples. One is it's made the production of oil and natural gas immensely more efficient by being able to take huge sums of geological data and figure out how to most efficiently drill a well. Today, you might drill one well to reach the same amount of product that 10 years ago it would have taken probably 15 wells. So it's good from a capital expense standpoint, and it's great for the environment. That means there's that many less wells and that much less drilling. Another great example that people are starting to kind of hone on to is energy efficiency. The ability of computers to connect every single appliance in your house that consumes electricity and work in concert to make sure that you're not using electricity when you don't need to, because every unit of energy that you don't have to use is the easiest one to save. And whether it's smart thermostats, there's a couple of pilot communities that are popping up around the country where there's a centralized computer that runs everything. I mean, it runs your heating and cooling, it runs your water heater, it runs your refrigerator, and even your toaster. And it becomes, once you get the hang of it, it becomes really convenient because it can anticipate what you're looking for and have it ready to go. And more importantly, not using unneeded electricity in the meantime.
That's another thing that I think about from time to time. We get so focused on the most energy efficient vehicle, the most energy efficient manufacturing process. And then and so many of us go to homes that were built, 60, 70, 100 years ago that are, heated in some cases by forced air, in some cases by hydronic heat. But you're right. I mean, there's not a lot of logic that goes into heating an entire 3,000 square foot house from one end to the other to 72 degrees, 24 hours a day when you're spending your time in one room. So lots and lots of opportunity to use smart technology to reduce consumption in that fashion. We had a guest on the podcast and within the last year, I think Aaron Yachfeld, who's the chief executive of Generac Corporation. A lot of people think of them as a standby electric generator company or standby home power and industrial power, and they do that. But they've been very acquisitive in the world of smart technology, using smart sensors and smart devices to create more efficient use of technology in our homes. So it's going to be really fun. And Aaron actually speculated a couple of things when he was on the podcast about what might be coming. I want to give you, Christopher, the same opportunity. Dream a little bit with us and tell us, if you look out over the course of the next 5 or 10 years, are there some technologies on the horizon that would really blow our listeners away?
Yes, but I learned a long time ago that nobody has any basis in predicting. We never would have seen the shale revolution. Nobody saw the shale revolution coming, and it transformed not only this country but the world,
right,
in a matter of years. And that's one of the reasons why we try to fight in Congress for technology neutral policies. I mean, figure out what the end goal is, and then let the market dictate how you get there. But what I would say the most promising technologies, I mean, I already mentioned advanced nuclear. I know a lot of people within the climate space, within the utility space, that foresee, on the order of 100 of these reactors being built in this country, over the next 2 decades. I mean, it's a big if. Hydrogen also. Hydrogen, we kind of call it the Swiss Army knife of energy. It can be used for vehicles and mobility. Electric vehicles are starting to catch on from a commercial standpoint, from an individual user standpoint, but they really don't work well when it comes to like long haul trucking or vehicles that need a lot of power and torque. They're very heavy, and they just can't be brought to bear the way that hydrogen can. And so we see heavy equipment manufacturers really looking at utilizing hydrogen as that clean source, but still have the same effectiveness and efficiency that they do with gasoline or diesel. One technology that's been talked about for decades, going back to the 60s, is fusion. I mean, the opposite of the nuclear power we have now. Instead of stashing atoms together, you pull one apart. And the Department of Energy, through its national laboratories, which are a crown jewel of innovation around the world, but especially for us, they made an important breakthrough 2 months ago in that they had the first fusion reaction that produced more energy than it consumed. Now, that doesn't mean that we're going to see a fusion reactor tomorrow, but it's the biggest breakthrough we've seen since people have been talking about fusion going back, like I said, 50, 60 years. And if that is a technology that can be harnessed and brought to bear, there's no waste. The byproduct is water, and if it can be done at scale, theoretically, it can be very, very, very cheap. So we'll see. I mean, it's just as a lawyer and not an engineer or a scientist, I've really learned to just never doubt the ability of America's engineers and scientists, because you give them a problem, they'll fix it. They'll fix it eventually. It may take 2 years, it may take 20 years, but eventually one of them is going to figure it out. And then with the advent of AI and supercomputing, it's moving exponentially faster. So, I mean, the future is exciting. I mean, I don't want to die just so I can see what happens.
Yeah, I don't want to die for a lot of reasons, but that's a key one, is just watching technology roll out over the course of the ensuing decades. It really is a great time to be on the planet Earth. It's a great time to be an American. It's a great time to be a student too, for that matter. We do have a lot of students that listen to the Tech Ed podcast and teachers that will play it in their classrooms and so on. So I want to take, as we close out our time with Christopher Guith this afternoon, today here on the Tech Ed podcast, I want to take a moment or two just to talk about the future, talk about students. What should students be learning about energy as they progress through their academic journey?
I would say anything. I mean, as a parent of two high school daughters who are very STEM focused, I mean, it alarms me every day with how little substance sometimes they're given when it comes to basic understanding of STEM coursework. It's very difficult to have a functional conversation in America these days without having that underlying understanding of basic scientific concepts. I talk to them all the time. I mean, environmental sciences are going to continue to be a growing field as more and more companies and governments look to remediate different environmental impacts that have been caused by industrial applications. At the end of the day, engineering kind of rules the world. I mean, without it, we don't have anything that we depend upon. So the need for engineers is only going to increase exponentially. And even with AI, it's widely sort of surmised that there's just some things that a really smart computer is never going to be able to do, but they will make it more useful. And I hate to say it, but lawyers still are perhaps way too much a part of this process. And having smart lawyers who understand the law and why the law exists and using it to apply to different building or new applications is critically important, because we've talked about the future and what may happen. We talked about the energy transition and all of the new technology that needs to be built. But the problem is that we have a permitting process that's broken. It's very difficult to build anything in this country, especially something that crosses state lines, like a transmission line or a pipeline. And there's an increasing understanding from both parties that this process is broken and it needs to be fixed. And we just launched a campaign today with a letter to Congress signed by 350 very, very diverse groups, renewable groups, broadband groups, water infrastructure groups, ports, even things like entities that deal with forest fire mitigation. I mean, these are all applications that affect us every single day. And we want them to happen, but this permitting process delays it, and some cases makes it impossible to happen. And so we're really hopeful that we can rekindle that bipartisan magic and get Congress to fix the system.
Rekindle that bipartisan magic. Indeed, we would be huge advocates of that ourselves. So thank you for putting that so succinctly. Certainly agree on STEM. You sound like a bit of a recovering attorney, by the way, as you talk about about opportunities in the world of law and impacts of things like artificial intelligence. The critical importance of engineers. Just really, you're right. Nothing happens from a technology standpoint without one, and so much of our very way of life and everything that we enjoy as Americans is because an engineer had an idea, an ability to develop, an ability to bring a product to market. Really good points that you make there, Christopher. We're going to give you one last opportunity, and this list of great points that you've made on the Tech Ed podcast. I want you to turn the clock back. You talked about having a couple daughters in high school. So let's think back to when you were about that age. Let's say you're 15 years old, and love asking about people's life experiences and what they've learned. If you could go back in time and tell that 15-year-old Christopher Guith one thing, what would that one thing be?
Go into finance. As important as engineers are, the banks and the capital managers are almost equally important, because you could have the greatest idea in the world and know exactly how to make it happen, but without the financing, it doesn't happen. And I see the marketplace values that, and that's why careers in the finance industry are so lucrative. So whatever it is you want to do with your life, you can still touch it through finance, whether it's the energy transition or whether it's curing cancer or what have you. And I think that's what I would tell myself.
I accused you of being a recovering attorney. I'm a recovering accountant, believe it or not. Most people mistake me for an engineer, but I have a little bit of that background in my background. On the other hand, you ended up in a great place with an amazing career, doing really cool work, and your tremendous knowledge of energy policy, the inner workings of Washington, D.C., how all of this stuff affects us on a global basis was really fascinating topic. The individuals that said you'd be a great guest were exactly right. And I really appreciate you jumping on with us to educate our listeners about the world of energy and energy policy and your background, all the other great conversations that we've had today. Christopher, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Tech Ed Podcast. If you haven't already, subscribe, leave a review, and if you liked this episode, share it with a friend. New episodes launch every Tuesday, so listen in next week.